I titled today's Neville Goddard conversation, Inner Conversations Play Out with Others. One of the reasons why I keep encouraging this discussion of how others show up saying the same things and playing out the theater of how we see ourselves to be, what we imagine them to say. In personal life, this encourages the idea that there are people out there that are interested in living the exact same way you desire to live, in mutual harmony, in relationship, the exact kind of relationships that you want. I also encourage this professionally because there are also clients ready to receive the products or services that we create. This is something that I initially encouraged in myself as I read Think and Grow Rich in 2004, which played out, and over the years continues to play out to a higher degree. And I'm fully convinced that this is how reality works. Now, this wasn't the case in the earlier stages of the journey. So today I would like to further encourage this in relation to our recent conversations with Neville's work so that we can have the kind of relationships that we would like to have in our life. So to stimulate this conversation, here's a quote from Neville. He says, "Sow an imaginary conversation, you reap an act. Sow an act, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you reap a character. Sow a character, you reap your destiny." So we see the parallel here to this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, in which he says, "Sow a thought, and you reap an action. Sow an action, and you reap a habit. Sow a habit, and you reap a character. Sow a character, and you reap a destiny." As Earl Nightingale had mentioned in The Strangest Secret, many ways of saying the exact same thing, that we become what we think about, since we experience five sensory in imagination. And what I find is it could be inner conversation, it could be one of the senses, or all of the five senses in imagination. And accepting that as the reality from the premise of you are complete inside. The world exists within you, and you are free to travel in imagination. There are infinite states, and you can identify with whatever state that you desire by releasing to identification with the five sensory experience. I recommend doing this after meditation, or we could do this at the end of the night, as he says here. The only reason you and I are functioning as we are today and not aware of the greater outlook is simply because we are creatures of habit. And habit renders us totally blind to what otherwise we could see. But habit is not law. You can create a new approach to life. So if a person has a habitual way of thinking and living, which is, let's say, people don't show up playing the kind of theater that I desire in my personal life or business life, he says we can create a new approach to life. And so when I read Think and Grow Rich, and around that time, I was exposed to this kind of information in 2004. These kinds of ideas that people show up saying the exact same thing that you imagine. When you commit to a goal, a vision, a definite chief aim, others show up in harmony and in contribution. There are people out there that also genuinely and authentically want to be with you. These kinds of ideas, as I encouraged it and saw it in my experience. For example, when I started the IT business, when I started the consulting business, when I started this YouTube channel, people started showing up immediately. Clients, mastermind partners, mentors, they started to show up immediately. However, this wasn't my experience before working with this information, because my inner conversation was more of one of separation, disconnect. People don't want to be around me. People are not interested in me. As we recognize that we are complete in imagination, and we feel it by imagining what implies, by suggesting it to ourselves, and I recommend working with autosuggestion, creating statements of how you see yourself to be in relation with others, and accept it via imaginary conversation. And we see people play out the theater. For example, when I'm out and about, when I travel, I always meet people that want to share the same experiences that I desire to experience. This is true in personal life and business life because I released the identification to the idea that it's not possible. Number two, that what I desire does not desire me back. Number three, which is similar, what I want does not want me back. Number four, I identified with the idea, which I recognize as fact in my imagination, that giving and receiving is one. There's always others out there who want to share that experience. And then what I notice then is things tend to move flowingly, more effortlessly, and automatically. I have released from behavioral-based controlling aspects as the outer aspects of life flow more from an accepting, completion, allowing based self-image, which I relate over to the authentic self-image. I'll put a link in the description to that discussion. So he says, we can create a new approach to life. If you and I would spend a few minutes every day, and I consider this an investment, withdrawing our attention from the region of sensation and concentrating it on an invisible state, and remain faithful to this contemplation, feeling and sensing the reality of an invisible state, thinking, feeling, or in combination, thinking, feelingly, we would in time become aware of this greater world, this dimensionally larger world. The state contemplated is now a concrete reality displaced in time. And so this is the talent. As he says, use the talent to change the attitude of mind towards life and bring about radical changes corresponding with the inner changes in the outer aspects of your life. So we change how we think in relationship with others, in relation with others, and everything changes to reflect that. So let's go back to the beginning here. This is sowing an imaginary conversation. And also, for example, he shares, you want to congratulate him. So inner conversation. You want to hear his voice. You want to hear him tell you he has never been so happy in a job in his life. He has never been so gainfully employed, and he loves going to work. He loves everything about his job. You actually hear him as though you heard him. Now you clothe it with all the tones of reality. And so here he adds a distinction. If you have 2 talents, give it 2. If you have 5, give it 5. So the way I relate to this is I can apply 5 sensory in imagination. Or I could use one of the senses. For example, I like to work with auditory and visual. One can work with eyesight, hearing, taste, touch, smell in imagination, in combination or sum. And imagine what implies that reality now. As a person does this, they will notice the changes. They observe the experiences in their day-to-day life that are representations of that symbolic imaginary conversation. So we see then, we reap an act. And as we continue to acknowledge the changes that occur, this further stimulates and encourages imaginal inner conversation that are aligned with how you truly want to be. And this becomes the habit, the character, and the destiny. And so now I've had this conversation with many mentors, teachers, trainers, therapists, psychoanalysts, consultants, advisors. And we brought this to the recognition that every day we have an opportunity to practice this. So I do this in business with clients, with team members, with vendors, business partners. He says, now come back to the friend in need. Represent him to yourself as though he now embodied the state you want him to realize in this world. If it is a job, see him gainfully employed. So every day we have the opportunity to imagine or think of people from the perspective of love, which is how they truly are, and see them as that person now, whatever it implies, in our imagination. We could do this real time, which in conversations with individuals in those professions, they have the opportunity to do this, apply this information that Neville has shared, and actually see the changes. They can also recognize from forming this habit and sowing this character, this is also true in all areas of their life in the different ways they relate with others. So we really decide then, how we see ourselves to be in our ideal and how others show up to represent that ideal. And recognize that from the completion within, all potentialities, all possibilities exist now in the infinite world of imagination. And the outer is an expression. Body moves as an expression. As we discussed in Tuesday's video in regards to personal magnetism, the conversation, the words, the behaviors, those are the effects of the state of mind. And so we imagine what implies, like he shares. You want to congratulate him. You want to hear his voice. You want to hear him tell you he has never been so happy in a job in his life. He has never been so gainfully employed, and he loves going to work. He loves everything about his job. You actually hear him as though you heard him. Now you clothe it with all the tones of reality, five sensory in imagination. And again, the distinction, if a person wants to do auditory, and I like auditory, and so when I came across this information, Napoleon Hill mentioned autosuggestion. And I found autosuggestion, or inner conversation, to be effective because I recognize that inner conversation is one of my talents. I can speak myself into believing whatever I want to believe. I can speak myself into feeling a certain way. I can speak myself into behaving a certain way. I can completely clear my mind and fill it up with a distinct inner conversation of how I imagine it to be and operate from that premise. And so working with this information, we find our way, and each person I recommend finding their own way, recognize the important truth. We can, if we would like to, identify with thoughts. We have the ability to identify with whatever thoughts, and we also have the ability to suggest whatever we would like to ourselves. And if a person is overly identified with emotional patterns, thinking patterns, or behavioral patterns in which they persistently conclude themselves and reality to work and relating with others to work in a way that they deep down inside know that's not how they truly want to live, then it's important to dedicate some time each day to release from those thinking patterns and identify with how you really want it to be, as he says here. So an imaginary conversation, you reap an act. Sow an act, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you reap a character. Sow a character, you reap your destiny. And so he gives the approach, as he says here. We can create a new approach to life. We can live how we truly desire to live. How we have been living up to this point, we want to ask ourselves some questions. How do we know that we're living is the only way to live? What is a way that I truly desire to live? Recognizing that as I identify with that consciously, it harmonizes with the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind automatically expresses it as the five sensory experience. Who says you have to live a certain way? According to who? Knowing that we are the suggester within, the only suggester in which we could suggest anything to ourselves. We can carry on an inner conversation from the premise of whatever we desire. Are we listening to our intuition and inner voice to find the true and accurate meaning of how we really want to live and committing to that inner voice, living from the premise of how we genuinely want to live? And I recognized as a result of working with this information that that is how I truly desire to live. People showing up in harmony and in contribution to my goals, my visions, my definite chief aims, and I show up in harmony and in contribution to their goals, their visions, their definite chief aims, which reminds me of the Dr. Millikan affirmation, one of my favorites, that Neville has brought up. I have a lavish, steady, dependable income consistent with mutual integrity and benefit. As the person engages with this kind of self-talk and applies what we perhaps spoke about, elaborated in Thursday's video, in which he spoke of James Allen's As a Man Thinketh and the 7-day mental diet, more specifically what Emmett Fox shares in the 7-day mental diet. They'll be able to easily entertain that idea of how they consciously want to relate with others. And all this is done from a place of lightheartedness, ease, authenticity. What we will notice, what we will acknowledge, what we will observe is the changes. And as a person witnesses those changes in their life, in how they relate to others and how others relate to them, from the premise of that inner conversation, they recognize, as we always say, reality is the affirmation in mind. Or we could say inner conversation in mind, autosuggestion in mind. And so working with this information and continuing to return to this information from the perspective of mutual benefit and harmony, And I brought up the Dr. Millikan affirmation, I have a lavish, steady, dependable income consistent with mutual integrity and benefit. This also can translate into different kinds of relationships, friendships, romantic relationships. Engaging in an inner conversation, perhaps like, I have steady, dependable, reliable, mutually beneficial relationships, friendships, something like that. Or you could self-suggest the suggestion that I integrated into a belief of how reality works, which is what I desire desires me back. People show up in harmony and in contribution to my vision. I show up in harmony and in contribution to their vision. Others desire to have the same experiences that I desire to have. And then we'll notice, and again, I recommend watching the series of videos we did on this topic in regard, upon reflection and with respects to Neville's information, in which we discuss the same things in many different ways, on how people show up relating with us in the same way we imagine. And that's another reason why I always suggest repetition of the same information and repetition of the same information from different perspectives. I remember listening to Bob Proctor one time, and he said that he would walk around listening to Earl Nightingale's Strangest Secret over and over again. And I also did that for years since I discovered it in 2007. And I still enjoy listening to it regularly. And here's what I would also like to encourage, that this becomes a natural way of life for you, as it has become with me. So again, let's go back to this quote here. Sow an imaginary conversation, you reap an act. Sow an act, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you reap a character. Sow a character, you reap your destiny. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. Let's go ahead and conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage. We can say, I recognize that every day I have the opportunity to represent others from the perspective of how they truly are, which is love, completion, and harmony. I recognize that this true and accurate inner conversation is also symbolic of how I see myself, and thus others show up to mirror that experience. I recognize that with the two gifts of speech and mind, I can discover, imagine, and experience whatever I truly desire. I recognize that the imaginal act is fact, and thus decision to reveal the people, resources, ideas in harmony and in contribution with how I truly desire to live, and also in harmony and in contribution with how others truly desire to live. If you would like a copy of this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.